Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back to a world where sandals were the height of fashion, concrete was cutting-edge tech, and everyone agreed that bathing together was a social activity, not a lawsuit. Welcome to the Roman Empire, at its absolute peak. Now before we get too cozy, go ahead and dim the lights, maybe pour a glass of something relaxing. Wine if you're feeling Roman, water if you're realistic, and settle in. Because tonight we're not talking about battles or emperors going mad. We're talking about everyday life during the height of Rome's power, when it was rich, weird, and just slightly falling apart underneath all that marble. So, the year is around 117 CE. The emperor is Trajan, Rome's golden boy, the man who ruled the largest empire the Mediterranean ever saw. The borders stretch from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, from Spain to Mesopotamia. It's like if the modern European Union, parts of Africa, and a good chunk of the Middle East were all managed by one guy, without Wi-Fi, maps, or the ability to text his generals, and somehow it worked. Mostly. Let's drift into the streets of Rome, the capital. The air smells like a mix of olive oil, sweat, and something burning that definitely shouldn't be. Crowded, noisy, chaotic, and alive. There are vendors shouting about their figs being fresher than everyone else's figs, politicians pretending to care about the people, and slaves doing, well, pretty much everything else. If you were a Roman citizen, lucky you. Citizenship was the golden ticket. It meant legal rights, property ownership, and the thrilling ability to not be crucified for fun. Everyone else, that was a little more negotiable. The city itself was a contradiction. Grand temples, white marble statues, fountains, and aqueducts, all looking pristine in the sunlight. But right next to them, cramped apartments stacked 6 stories high, made mostly of wood, that burned down so often it was practically a national sport. Most people lived in these insula apartment blocks that were, let's be honest, one leaky pipe away from disaster. The ground floor might have a bakery or tavern. The upper floors, where the poorer folks lived, were small, dark, and hot enough in summer to bake bread on the windowsill. But still, life was bustling. There were public baths, markets, theatres, and something resembling a postal system. You could grab some street food, probably bread, olives and cheese, watch a gladiator match, and still have time to complain about taxes before bed. Ah yes, taxes. Rome's favourite pastime after conquering. Now the economy. At its peak, Rome's economy ran on a mix of trade, agriculture, and a slightly awkward amount of forced labour. There were trade routes stretching across the known world, silks from China, spices from India, and gold from Africa. The Mediterranean was basically a Roman lake, dotted with ships moving everything from grain to gossip. Grain was especially important. If Rome stopped getting its grain shipments from Egypt, people got hungry. And when Romans got hungry, they rioted. So, emperors made sure the grain kept flowing, even if that meant invading yet another region. For security, of course. Most Romans, though, weren't merchants or nobles. They were farmers, soldiers, artisans, or slaves. Life revolved around family, work, and trying to avoid plagues, which, unfortunately, was harder than it sounded. If you were a Roman farmer, your life was simple, but exhausting. Sunrise to sunset, you worked your land, hoping the taxes didn't eat up your profits. Rome had this charming habit of taxing everything: property, goods, imports, even inheritance. Nothing said family bonding like the government showing up to tax your dead uncle's house. Let's drift a little higher up the social ladder, to the elites. If you were rich in Rome, you were rich. Your home wasn't an apartment. It was a domus, a sprawling house with courtyards, mosaics, and fountains. You probably had more servants than friends, which, to be fair, might have overlapped. Your days started with a visit to the baths, because apparently hygiene was a group activity. You'd socialize, discuss politics, gossip, and maybe close a business deal while wearing very little. Then you'd head home for lunch, which might include delicacies like dormice stuffed with nuts and honey, because why not double down on weird flexes? And of course, there were dinner parties. Roman banquets were legendary. Multi-course feasts where guests reclined on couches, slaves served endless wine, and poets performed questionable verses. Conversation topics ranged from philosophy to who was sleeping with whose spouse. A timeless tradition, really. Now the family. In Rome, the household was ruled by the paterfamilias, the oldest male. He had legal authority over everyone, including adult sons and married daughters. He could arrange marriages, control finances, and technically even execute family members if they stepped too far out of line. Did he usually do that? Not often, but still, the threat added a little tension to family dinner. Women, despite the patriarchy, had more influence than you might expect. Wealthy Roman women could own property, run businesses, and even fund public projects, as long as they did it under the polite fiction that a man was somehow involved. Many were educated, literate, and politically savvy, just quietly so. Marriage, of course, wasn't about love. It was about alliances, wealth, and status. Divorce was easy. Either party could just declare it over. And remarriage was common. Romans were practical like that. If at first your marriage doesn't succeed, try again with someone richer. Let's float toward religion for a bit. The Romans were not subtle about gods. They had a pantheon so crowded it was hard to keep track. Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Venus, and about 100 others, each with their own temples and sacrifices. Religion wasn't a personal thing. It was public, political, and deeply social. If your city had good harvests or victories, thank the gods. If something went wrong, famine, plague, bad omens, better sacrifice something quick before Jupiter noticed. And sacrifices could get creative, not usually human, that was considered barbaric, but animals, food, wine, and occasionally very expensive incense, because nothing says divine respect like burning imported perfume. As the empire grew, new religions seeped in. Egyptian cults, Eastern mystery religions, and eventually Christianity. Though at this stage, Christians were still a small, slightly suspicious group that the government occasionally persecuted, mostly out of confusion. Let's pause for a moment and just picture it. The marble city glowing in the sunset, senators in white togas strolling through the forum, slaves carrying scrolls, kids chasing stray dogs, merchants haggling in the market, and somewhere in the background, someone loudly reading poetry that no one asked for. This was Rome at its height. Proud, loud, self-assured, and a little too convinced it would last forever. Of course, underneath the marble, the cracks were already forming. Corruption, overextension, and the fact that half the empire depended on the other half's taxes to stay afloat. But for now, no one noticed. Or maybe they just didn't care. When you've built the biggest empire the world has ever seen, a few cracks probably feel like nothing. So for now, let's stay here, in this golden glow. The baths are steaming, the amphitheatres are full, and the empire hums like a well-fed lion in the sun. Because the fall will come soon enough. But that's for another night. Part 2. Bread, baths, and bad plumbing. A day in the life of a Roman citizen. Hey guys, welcome back. Let's stretch a little, get cozy again, and drift right back into Rome. Not the dramatic, sword-clashing, marble column kind of Rome, but the one that smelled faintly of fish sauce and ambition. Tonight, we're taking a walk through the average Roman day, because for all the emperors, temples and marble busts, Rome was still a place full of regular people just trying to get through their schedules without getting trampled by a chariot. So, imagine this. The sun is rising over the city. The air is hazy, full of smoke and chatter. You wake up on your straw mattress, or if you're lucky, a wooden frame covered with wool, to the sound of merchants shouting, animals braying, and someone nearby arguing about water rations again. You might be a shopkeeper, a soldier, a baker, or maybe just someone who spends the day waiting for the public baths to open. Whatever your role, your day begins early. Romans liked mornings. They thought working hard before noon was virtuous, which is adorable in hindsight. Breakfast was modest. They called it ientaculum, and it usually meant bread, maybe dipped in wine or olive oil. If you were well off, maybe you threw in some cheese or fruit. No eggs Benedict, no fancy spreads, just basic fuel for a long day of doing Roman things. And if you were poor, you might skip it altogether. Bread wasn't always affordable, and there were always taxes, debts, and rent to pay. Still, everyone shared the same philosophy. Keep it simple, get moving, and if the gods are kind, there'll be more food later. After breakfast, the city came alive. The streets were narrow, busy and loud. Donkeys clattered by with carts full of grain. Vendors shouted from stalls piled high with olives, pottery, and sometimes suspicious-looking seafood. The smell was noticeable. Most Romans lived without running water or toilets in their homes, so the city had public fountains and latrines. And the latrines were communal. Imagine a long marble bench with holes, no dividers, and a polite good morning to your neighbour while both of you do your business. Yes, the Romans were advanced in many ways. Privacy just wasn't one of them. Public hygiene, though, they took seriously, or at least publicly. Baths were everything. The public bathhouse, or thermae, was a cornerstone of Roman life. It was where you exercised, socialized, networked, and complained about politics. Think of it as a mix between a gym, a spa, and a coffee shop, with a dash of casual nudity. A typical visit started in the apoditerium, the changing room, where you'd leave your clothes and pray they'd still be there when you came back. Then you'd move to the tepidarium, a warm room to ease in, followed by the caldarium, the hot steam chamber. Finally, you'd finish in the frigidarium, a cold plunge that allegedly improved circulation and humility. There were slaves to help apply oils, scrape off sweat with a strigil, a curved metal scraper, and carry your towels. People talked business, shared gossip, and debated philosophy while sweating profusely. You weren't really a Roman citizen if you didn't spend half your day in a towel, arguing about Cicero, and for women, there were separate hours or smaller baths, not quite as luxurious, but still social hubs, a place to catch up on news, fashion, or which senator was being scandalous this week. After the baths came lunch, prandium, usually cold leftovers, bread, fruit, maybe some cheese or salted fish. Simple and quick because the main event was dinner. Romans loved dinner. It was their daily performance. If you were rich, cena could last hours. Reclining on couches, sipping wine, eating course after course, fish, pork, vegetables, honeyed pastries. There might be entertainment, musicians, dancers, maybe even a poet reciting verses about how great the host was. For the poor, dinner was bread again, maybe a stew if you were lucky. But even then, it was a chance to relax, to sit outside in the warm air and listen to the hum of the city. Because no matter your status, evenings in Rome had a rhythm. Lamps flickering, distant laughter, the faint echo of sandals on stone. Let's talk about entertainment though, because the Romans didn't exactly do subtle. The Colosseum, of course, was the crown jewel, a massive amphitheatre that could seat up to 50,000 people. And what did they do with it? Gladiator fights, wild animal hunts, mock sea battles. Yes, they once filled the arena with water and staged naval combat, because if you can't humble nature, at least drown it for sport. Gladiators were mostly slaves or prisoners, trained to fight for the crowd's amusement. It sounds horrific now, and it was. But for Romans, it was tradition, a demonstration of courage and honor. Even the emperors attended, waving casually as men risked their lives for applause. But not all entertainment was violent. There were theatres, chariot races and poetry recitals. The Circus Maximus, Rome's massive racetrack, drew crowds in the hundreds of thousands. Charioteers were ancient celebrities, complete with fan clubs and rival factions that occasionally rioted. So yes, fandom wars existed 2,000 years ago, only with more horses. Now let's glide into something quieter. Religion. Romans were endlessly spiritual, but in a transactional way. They prayed not for love or forgiveness, but for success, health, and good crops. Religion was like a public utility. If you honored the gods, they'd hopefully not smite your city with plagues. Households had their own guardian spirits, Lares and Penates, represented by small statues. Every morning, families offered food or wine to them, a little domestic peace treaty with the supernatural. Public rituals were common too. Priests oversaw sacrifices, augurs read omens in bird patterns, and everyone pretended to understand what it all meant. When something big happened, like an emperor dying or a volcano erupting, the Senate usually blamed it on neglected rituals. It was the ancient equivalent of, "Have you tried turning it off and on again?" Speaking of emperors, life under their rule was a mixed bag. During the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, things were relatively stable. The army kept borders secure, roads were maintained, trade thrived. But emperors themselves were a colourful bunch. Some, like Trajan or Marcus Aurelius, were competent and respected. Others, like Nero or Caligula, were more creative. If you were a regular citizen, though, politics barely touched your life. You cared more about grain prices than Senate debates. Still, imperial propaganda was everywhere. Statues, coins and inscriptions constantly reminding you how benevolent your ruler was. A bit like living inside a never-ending PR campaign. Now, let's float to the quieter corners of Roman life, the small, human details. Children played with dolls, balls and dice. Teenagers studied rhetoric, philosophy, or how to look impressive while doing nothing. Street musicians played flutes and drums. Bakers worked through the night. And amid it all, life pulsed on. Fires occasionally broke out. Diseases swept through. Emperors came and went. But the rhythm stayed the same. The people of Rome woke, worked, bathed, ate, and slept under the same Mediterranean sky for centuries. Even slaves, who made up as much as a third of the population, found small ways to carve out normality. They cooked, sang, fell in love, and sometimes even earned their freedom. Not all stories ended tragically, though most were quiet, lost in the noise of history. Let's pause here for a breath. You can almost hear it, can't you? The chatter of markets, the hum of fountains, the echo of sandals on stone streets. The empire was a machine powered by people, not just the generals and emperors, but the bakers, bath attendants, farmers, and children chasing each other in dusty courtyards. For now, life is steady. The empire hums along. No one suspects that its foundations are already beginning to shift, slowly, invisibly. But we'll get there soon. Part 3. Bread, baths, and bureaucracy. The calm before the collapse. So, you've settled into your Roman villa. The wine is flowing. Your slaves are doing all the boring chores, and the empire looks unstoppable. But beneath that shiny marble surface, life in the 2nd century wasn't all toga parties and heroic speeches. It was more like endless paperwork, questionable plumbing, and the faint smell of public baths that tried really hard to hide centuries of body odor. Let's start with something Rome was famously proud of: its baths. The Romans genuinely believed that bathing was a civic duty, a public good, and a fine excuse to gossip about everyone else's affairs. The typical Roman bath complex wasn't just for cleaning. It was a full social hub, complete with steam rooms, massage halls, snack bars, and sometimes even libraries. Basically, an ancient version of a wellness center. If your wellness center also featured naked politicians loudly arguing about tax policy, people came to the baths daily. Rich, poor, everyone. It was cheap or even free in many cities. You'd strip down, oil up, scrape off the grime with a metal tool called a strigil, then soak in a series of hot and cold pools. Sounds relaxing, right? Well, it was, unless you were unlucky enough to visit when the water hadn't been changed in days. The heating system, called the hypocaust, worked by channeling hot air under the floors, which was great, until it caused the occasional carbon monoxide issue. So, yes, you could technically die of relaxation. Meanwhile, outside the baths, food was another Roman obsession. Bread was the cornerstone of daily life. So much so that bread in circuses became shorthand for how emperors kept the population happy. Feed them carbs, entertain them with lions, and they won't ask about the collapsing economy. The average Roman diet wasn't bad though. They had access to grains, olives, fish sauce, because who doesn't want fermented anchovy juice on everything? Fruits, and occasionally meat. If you were rich, you could enjoy peacock tongues and flamingo brains, because subtlety wasn't really Rome's thing. Now let's talk about Roman bureaucracy. The empire was vast, stretching from Britain to Egypt, and someone had to keep track of all that tax money, grain shipments, and military pay. Enter the scribes, the accountants, and the layers upon layers of officials who turned governance into an art form of endless scrolls and stamps. Rome's bureaucracy was so detailed that some provinces were better managed under Roman rule than under modern governments. And yet, somehow, no one ever knew where the money actually went. Corruption was less of a scandal and more of a job perk. A governor might take bribes, skim taxes, and then donate part of it to fund a temple, calling it piety. Everyone pretended this was fine because technically it kept the marble flowing. Emperors themselves had to play along, rewarding loyalty and pretending to punish greed. Augustus started the trend of pretending to be humble while living in a mansion the size of a small country. By the 2nd century, this performance had become an art form. Speaking of emperors, let's check in on them for a moment. The 2nd century gave us some of Rome's so-called good emperors. Marcus Aurelius, Hadrian, Trajan, names you might recognize from statues and overly dramatic history channels. Trajan expanded the empire to its greatest size. Hadrian built a wall in Britain to keep out angry northerners. And Marcus Aurelius wrote a self-help book while fighting endless wars. The empire was stable, rich and well managed, which of course meant it was about due for disaster. Let's not skip over the daily grind of average citizens though. A Roman morning started early, usually with a simple breakfast of bread and cheese, then a day's work in whatever trade you were unlucky enough to be born into. Bakers worked before sunrise, blacksmiths roasted under the heat, farmers sweated in the fields, and slaves. Well, slaves did all of it, without pay, rest, or hope. Roman cities were crowded, noisy, and dangerous. Fire was a constant threat, especially in apartment blocks called insulae, which were basically ancient tenements built out of wood and wishful thinking. Collapses were common, and if you were lucky enough to survive the fire, you might still get fined for obstructing the street with the wreckage. Rome's fire brigades did exist, but they were also known for looting as much as rescuing. At least the Romans had entertainment. The Colosseum and smaller amphitheatres across the empire hosted gladiator games, mock naval battles, and animal hunts. But not every Roman was thrilled about it. Some philosophers complained that the games turned people into moral corpses, which, to be fair, was a pretty accurate description of someone who had spent 12 hours watching lions disembowel imported zebras. Meanwhile, religion still played a big part in daily life. The pantheon of gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and company, got offerings for everything. Lose your sandals? Blame Mercury. Stub your toe? Clearly Neptune's fault. The emperor himself was also worshipped as a god, which must have been awkward if you'd just insulted him last week. Religion wasn't so much about faith as it was about good manners toward powerful supernatural bureaucrats. And speaking of manners, Roman society ran on patronage. If you were poor, you needed a rich patron to protect you. In return, you'd run errands, attend his events, and flatter him endlessly. It was basically networking with extra steps. Entire mornings were spent visiting powerful men's houses to say, "Good morning, Lord of Everything, may your sandals never wear thin." In return, you might get a coin, a loaf of bread, or a seat at a dinner party. Far from the good wine. Of course, let's float for a moment to the women of the empire. Unlike their medieval descendants, Roman women actually had a surprising amount of freedom, at least compared to most of history. Wealthy women could own property, manage businesses, and even divorce their husbands. But before we call it progressive, keep in mind they were still legally under the authority of a man. First their father, then their husband, then their adult son if both of the others died. Independence was possible but rare. Women were expected to be modest, virtuous, and preferably invisible in public life. But some of them, like Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus, quietly controlled half the empire through charm, gossip, and sheer strategic patience. The same senators who mocked women's weakness would later cry when those same women outmaneuvered them politically. Still, everyday life for most Roman women meant managing the home, raising children, and supervising slaves. Childbirth was dangerous. Medicine was primitive, and if a husband got bored, he could simply trade you in for a younger model. So yes, slightly better than medieval Europe, but still not a great deal. By the time we drift into the late 2nd century, Rome has reached peak comfort and peak complacency. The empire is massive. The trade routes stretch across deserts, seas, and mountains. The population hits nearly 60 million. The emperors write philosophy instead of leading armies. Everything looks perfect, which in Roman terms means the collapse is officially warming up backstage. But before we watch the empire stumble toward chaos, let's linger a little longer in the calm, in the era of marble, mosaics, and bureaucratic bliss, because soon the baths will cool, the bread will mold, and the eternal city will remember that eternity is a very long time to stay functional. Part 4, The Golden Age, gets a bit tarnished. Hey again, still awake? Probably not, but if you are, let's quietly shuffle back into the Roman Empire, right around the end of the 2nd century. The marble is still shining. The senators are still pretending to be important, and the emperors are still trying to look divine in their statues. But under all that polish, there's a faint crack forming in the marble. Nothing too dramatic yet, just a few whispers of decline, a touch of overextension, and a few too many emperors with god complexes. We left off in the Age of Comfort, Rome at its most stable, organized, and smug. Now, we're entering what might be called the slow unraveling phase. Think of it like when your favorite sweater starts to fuzz and you pretend it's fine for a few more years. That was the Roman Empire after Marcus Aurelius. Marcus, the philosopher emperor, is often remembered as the wise, noble ruler who wrote Meditations, that book you probably bought during a self-improvement phase but never finished. He was calm, stoic, and thoughtful, which is nice for a diary but not ideal for running an empire constantly on fire. He spent most of his reign fighting wars on the frontiers, especially against tribes along the Danube. These weren't glamorous wars either. They were muddy, cold, and miserable. And yet, Marcus handled it like a professional, quietly philosophical about the whole thing. Until, of course, his son Commodus showed up and turned everything into a circus. Commodus was, how should we put this, not his father. Where Marcus was calm and restrained, Commodus was flamboyant, egotistical, and believed himself to be the reincarnation of Hercules. He even carried a club and wore a lion skin to prove it, which, if you think about it, is the ancient Roman version of walking around in a superhero costume while declaring yourself CEO of Earth. Under Commodus, the empire's vibe shifted from stable administration to chaotic theme park. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, which basically means Commodus City. He renamed the months after himself. And then, because that wasn't enough self-promotion, he began performing as a gladiator in the arena. Imagine the emperor of the world's most powerful civilization putting on leather armor and dramatically fighting actors, pretending to be terrified. The people loved it, for a while. But the Senate, of course, hated it. Dignity mattered to them. And watching the emperor decapitate ostriches for sport didn't exactly scream respectable governance. Eventually, Commodus was strangled in his bath by his wrestling partner, because even his assassinations had to be theatrical. His death marked the end of the so-called Pax Romana, the 200-year stretch of relative peace and stability that made Rome the envy of the world. What followed was chaos. Between 193 and 235 AD, the empire cycled through more than 20 emperors. Some ruled for years, others for months. A few didn't even make it to their coronation before being stabbed by their own guards. It was called the crisis of the 3rd century, though honestly it could have been called the Great Roman Identity Crisis. Every general with an army suddenly thought, you know what, I'd make a great emperor. So they marched on Rome, killed whoever was in charge, and then got assassinated by someone else a few months later. It was less an empire and more a revolving door of men who really should have stayed in the provinces. Economically, things started to wobble too. Inflation hit hard. The silver content in Roman coins dropped so low that by the late 3rd century, a denarius was basically a shiny button. The government tried to fix it by printing more money, which, as always, fixed absolutely nothing. Prices soared, trade suffered, and soldiers began demanding payment in actual goods instead of currency. Meanwhile, the frontiers were getting restless. Germanic tribes were pushing in from the north, Persians from the east, and local rebellions popped up like unwanted mushrooms. Whole provinces were breaking away, forming their own mini-empires. You know things are bad when even Gaul wants to go solo. Through all of this, regular Roman citizens just kept trying to live their lives. They still went to the baths, still baked their bread, still listened to gossip about which general had declared himself emperor this week. Life was surprisingly normal in many cities, if you ignored the occasional barbarian raid or grain shortage. Religion began to shift during this period too. The old gods, Jupiter, Mars and Venus, were still around, but belief was getting a little thin. People started turning to mystery cults and imported deities from the east, Isis, Mithras, and a small but growing group who followed a crucified preacher from Judea. Christianity was still fringe, but it was quietly spreading through the cities, offering a message of hope that contrasted pretty sharply with the constant political despair. Then came a rare moment of stability under Emperor Diocletian, who decided to fix everything with bureaucracy. His solution was to divide the empire in half, east and west, because, as everyone knows, Doubling the paperwork always helps. He created a system called the tetrarchy, meaning 4 rulers sharing power. On paper, it looked efficient. In practice, it looked like 4 egos colliding in slow motion. Still, Diocletian managed to restore some order. He reformed taxes, strengthened the army, and built massive new palaces. He even tried to control inflation with something called the Edict on Maximum Prices, a long list of how much everything was supposed to cost, which people immediately ignored. Eventually, he retired to grow cabbages in his palace on the Dalmatian coast. That's not a joke. The man literally quit ruling the world to garden, which honestly sounds like the healthiest decision anyone in Roman politics ever made. After Diocletian, Constantine came along. You've definitely heard of him. The first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. Constantine's reign marked the empire's slow transformation from a pagan powerhouse to a Christian one. He moved the capital east to Byzantium, renamed it Constantinople, and declared Christianity a legal religion. It was a huge cultural shift. Temples to Jupiter were being replaced by churches. Gladiator games began to fade. The old Roman values, honor, glory, and endless marble construction were slowly being replaced by a more spiritual, sometimes more austere outlook. The empire's identity was changing. But before we drift too far into that transition, it's worth pausing here, because this is where Rome's golden age officially ends. The empire isn't gone yet, not by a long shot, but it's not the same confident marble-centered superpower it once was. It's older, more brittle, a little tired, and maybe a bit too sure of its own greatness. So let's rest here for a bit, in the fading light of Rome's greatness. The baths still steam, the amphitheatres still echo, and the bureaucrats are still stamping documents no one will ever read. It's peaceful in its own way, but the wind is starting to shift. Next time, we'll drift into the twilight, the slow crumble, the invasions, and the strange beauty of an empire learning it can't last forever. Part 5. The Twilight of Empire. Hey there, still drifting. Good. Tonight, we're gliding into the part of Rome's story where things begin to quietly fall apart. Not with a dramatic explosion, but like a grand, overstuffed mansion slowly sagging under its own weight. The golden light of the empire has dimmed. Constantine's new capital in the east, Constantinople, is thriving, all shiny mosaics and Byzantine flair. Meanwhile, Rome itself, well, it's getting drafty. Fewer parades, fewer triumphs. The marble is chipped, the aqueducts need repairs, and the Senate mostly exists to look nostalgic. Let's set the mood. It's the late 4th century. Christianity is now the empire's official religion. The old gods are fading into myth, their temples converted into churches or left to crumble. You can still find a few diehards lighting incense to Jupiter, but now they're the weird uncles at family gatherings everyone pretends not to notice. In everyday life, people are adjusting to a strange mix of old and new. A Roman noble might still wear his toga for ceremonies, but he's just as likely to quote scripture as Cicero. Soldiers still march under imperial standards, but now some of those standards have crosses on them. The empire has split in two, east and west. The east, ruled from Constantinople, is rich, urban and organized. The west, ruled from Ravenna, is not. Think of it as the we're doing our best half. Most of the tax revenue comes from the east, and most of the invasions happen in the west. And speaking of invasions, yeah, that's starting to be a real problem. The Goths, Vandals, Huns and other groups are moving closer to Roman borders. They're not exactly organized armies, more like wandering nations, entire populations on the move, looking for somewhere safer to live. A lot of this is due to the Huns, those nomadic horse archers from Central Asia who showed up like a force of nature. They were fast, ruthless, and according to Roman accounts, kind of terrifying. They pushed the Germanic tribes westward, right into Roman territory. At first, Rome tried to handle it diplomatically, offering land, food, and money in exchange for peace. But as usual, promises were made, then ignored. Then suddenly everyone was fighting again. In 378 AD, the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens decided to deal with the Goths near the city of Adrianople. It didn't go well. The Romans underestimated the Gothic army, attacked in the blazing heat, and were utterly destroyed. Valens himself died in the battle, reportedly burned alive in a farmhouse after retreating from the field. The loss was catastrophic, not just militarily, but psychologically. Rome, the eternal empire, had been crushed by outsiders on its own soil. After Adrianople, something changed. Rome could still win battles, still build, still function, but the aura of invincibility was gone. Let's float forward to the early 400s. The western half of the empire is trying very hard to keep it together. They've got emperors, generals, and plenty of titles, but not a lot of stability. Armies are filled with mercenaries, many of them Germanic themselves. Loyalty is negotiable. One of the last great Roman generals was a man named Flavius Stilicho. He was half Vandal, half Roman, which was both impressive and politically inconvenient. Stilicho fought bravely to defend Italy, holding off invaders again and again. He was basically the duct tape holding the Western Empire together. Naturally, he was accused of treason and executed, because Rome couldn't resist sabotaging itself. After Stilicho, things got worse. In 410 AD, Rome, the city itself, was sacked for the first time in 800 years. The Visigoths, led by King Alaric, marched right in and looted the place. Now, to be fair, it wasn't the cinematic, fiery apocalypse people imagine. Most buildings were left standing, churches were spared, and there wasn't widespread destruction. But symbolically, it was devastating. Rome, once the mistress of the world, was now vulnerable. People started whispering that the old gods were angry, that abandoning Jupiter had cursed the empire. St. Augustine even wrote an entire book, The City of God, to calm everyone down. Over the next few decades, the Western Empire limped along. It still had emperors, though by this point they were mostly figureheads controlled by military strongmen or barbarian warlords. Provinces peeled away one by one. Britain was abandoned. Gaul and Spain fell to various Germanic kingdoms. North Africa was taken by the Vandals, who, true to their name, loved a bit of destruction but were surprisingly organized about it. Meanwhile, in the east, Constantinople was fine. They had walls, gold, and functioning bureaucracy. They even looked at the West's problems like, couldn't be us. Let's pause and picture life for an average Roman during this time. Not a senator or soldier, just a regular person. Maybe a baker in Ravenna or a farmer in southern Gaul. Taxes are high, the roads aren't as safe, the markets are smaller, the coins feel lighter, and rumours of barbarian raids drift in like bad weather reports. But life still goes on. People still get married, still raise children, still go to church on Sundays. The baths are a bit emptier, the aqueducts don't flow quite as strong, but there's a strange endurance in the air. Rome is falling, but slowly, so slowly that most people probably didn't even realize it. By the mid-400s though, it's clear the game is nearly up. The last emperor to really matter in the West is a boy named Romulus Augustulus. Yes, Romulus, like the mythical founder of Rome. Poetic, right? Unfortunately, he was more a puppet than a ruler. In 476 AD, a Germanic general named Odoacer marched into Italy, deposed him, and sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople. The message was simple: we're done here. And just like that, the Western Roman Empire was over. No grand finale, no thunderous collapse, just paperwork, a few resignations, and the quiet realization that the eternal city was now just another provincial town. The Eastern Roman Empire, of course, lived on as Byzantium for another 1,000 years, long enough to make sure the story didn't really end. But for the West, the curtain had quietly fallen. So what does that mean for our sleepy wander through Roman life? Well, even in its final years, Rome's influence didn't disappear. Its roads, laws, and language lingered. Its buildings became the bones of medieval cities. Its ideas about power and order still echo through every government that came after. The empire fell. Yes, but in a way, it never really left. Let's rest here then, in the afterglow of history. The aqueducts may be dry, but their arches still stand. The senators are gone, but their marble busts still stare out from museum halls. Rome may have faded, but its ghost is everywhere. Quiet, steady, eternal. Part 6. The quiet echo of empire. Hey there, still awake, or just floating somewhere between consciousness and the fall of civilization? Either way, let's stay here a little longer. Rome may have officially fallen, but its spirit didn't exactly clock out and go home. In fact, you could argue it just changed offices. After 476 AD, people didn't suddenly wake up and say, well, guess we're medieval now. That's not how history works. The fall of Rome was less like a car crash and more like a long, slow power outage. One room at a time, until you're sitting in the dark, holding a candle, pretending it's fine. In the ruins of the empire, old habits lingered. Latin was still the language of the educated. Roman law still influenced local customs. Even the idea of being Roman held weight. Many of the new rulers, those so-called barbarians, loved to call themselves Roman too. It sounded classier than King of the Visigoths who burned down your village. Take Theodoric the Great, for example. He ruled Italy in the late 400s and early 500s. Technically, he was an Ostrogoth, a Germanic leader, but in spirit, he was basically playing Roman emperor cosplay, with the full set, togas, titles, and senators. He even kept a version of the Roman bureaucracy running, because why fix what's barely functioning? Under Theodoric, Italy had this weird hybrid energy, part barbarian kingdom, part empire reboot. The Goths and Romans coexisted, sort of. The Romans handled the paperwork and tax collection, while the Goths handled, well, the swords. It was an uneasy balance, but it worked for a while. If you'd lived in Ravenna during this time, you'd still see Roman mosaics glittering in the churches. You'd still walk on roads built centuries earlier. The markets would still trade in grain, wine, and olive oil, just with slightly rougher manners and fewer imperial seals on everything. Further east, the Byzantine Empire, the surviving half of Rome, was alive and thriving. Constantinople, that new Rome, became the crown jewel of the medieval world. Its walls were so strong they shrugged off almost every invader for 1,000 years. Inside, scholars studied Greek philosophy, artisans crafted golden icons, and emperors argued with patriarchs about who got to be the ultimate authority, God or the bureaucracy. Byzantium saw itself as the continuation of Rome, not a replacement. Its emperors still called themselves Basileus Romaeon, Emperor of the Romans. They used Roman laws, wore Roman-style robes, and considered the Latin-speaking West a bit of a backwater, which, to be fair, it was becoming. Meanwhile, in the West, new kingdoms rose on Rome's grave. The Franks in Gaul, the Visigoths in Spain, the Vandals in North Africa. They adopted bits and pieces of Roman culture, a legal system here, an architectural trick there. Over time, these fragments blended into what we now call medieval Europe. Let's take a quiet walk through what daily life might have felt like in this post-Roman world. Imagine standing in a crumbling Roman villa in southern France. The mosaics are faded, the fountains dry. Sheep graze in the old courtyard. The local lord now lives where a senator once dined. He still uses the Latin word dominus for lord, but his armour is Frankish, and his religion is Catholic. The roads are emptier now, trade routes have broken apart, and merchants travel in nervous little caravans instead of grand imperial convoys. A journey that once took days now takes weeks. Letters arrive late, if at all. The postal system that once connected the empire is gone, replaced by word of mouth and wandering monks. Speaking of monks, this is their time to shine. As cities shrink and governments collapse, monasteries become little islands of order. They copy manuscripts, brew beer, tend gardens, and write things down, which, in the Dark Ages, is about as revolutionary as it gets. One of the most famous early monks was Benedict of Nursia, who founded the Benedictine order in the 6th century. His whole thing was pray and work, which, to be honest, sounds like the medieval version of grind and chill. Monks followed strict daily routines, copying texts for hours on end in cold scriptoria, their only entertainment the occasional miscopied letter or funny doodle in the margins. But thanks to them, we still have much of what we know from ancient Rome: literature, philosophy, even medical texts. The monks were the Wi-Fi of the early Middle Ages, slow, patchy, but vital. Meanwhile, the idea of empire wasn't completely gone. In 800 AD, the Frankish king Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope. The Holy Roman Empire was born, though, as the saying goes, it was neither holy nor Roman, nor really an empire, but it shows how powerful the ghost of Rome remained. 1,000 years after its fall, rulers were still trying to borrow its prestige, like kids wearing their parents' clothes. If you're wondering what life felt like for ordinary people in this transition, the short answer is harder. The safety and infrastructure of Rome were gone. Trade declined, cities shrank, and people moved back to rural life. Taxes might have lightened, but so did protection. Law enforcement became local. Basically, whoever had the biggest sword made the rules. Still, not everything was bleak. The collapse of imperial control also meant more independence for small communities. Local traditions revived, regional languages began to evolve, and people shaped their own customs without waiting for orders from Rome. Culturally, the old and new continued to mingle. Pagan festivals became Christian holidays. Roman gods became saints, at least in spirit. Even the Latin language morphed into new forms: Italian, French, Spanish, and the rest of the Romance family. So, while Rome was gone politically, linguistically, it was just branching out. If you think about it, that's kind of poetic. Empires end, but languages live on. Roads crumble, but ideas travel farther. Rome might have lost its armies, but it quietly conquered time. Let's drift back to the eastern half of the empire for a moment, where things remained impressively functional. Under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, Byzantium tried to bring back the old glory days. Justinian rebuilt Constantinople after riots burned much of it down. He constructed the Hagia Sophia, a breathtaking church with a dome so vast it seemed to float. He also launched a series of military campaigns to reconquer the West, North Africa, Italy, even parts of Spain. For a brief moment, it looked like the Roman Empire might reunite. But, as usual, ambition outran logistics. The wars drained resources, and soon the newly reconquered lands slipped away again. Still, Justinian did leave one lasting legacy: his legal code, the Corpus Juris Civilis. It organized centuries of Roman law into one massive, coherent system. It became the foundation for legal thinking in Europe for centuries to come. Basically, he turned Rome's chaos into an instruction manual for civilization. And that, in a sense, is what the post-Roman world was all about. Holding on to pieces of order amid the ruins. People didn't see themselves as living in a new era. They saw themselves as trying to keep the old one alive. Let's take a quiet moment here. Imagine sitting by candlelight in a stone monastery, listening to rain on the roof. A young monk dips his quill into ink and copies words written 1,000 years earlier by Cicero or Virgil. Outside, wolves howl in the dark forest. Inside, Rome survives, one line at a time. History isn't a series of sharp endings. It's a long echo. The empire fell, but its rhythm carried on. In languages, in laws, in art, in the quiet persistence of people who refuse to forget. And that, perhaps, is the real story of Rome. Not the battles or emperors, but the endurance of memory. Part 7. The Long Shadow of Rome. You know that feeling when something huge ends, but its presence lingers, like the warmth left on a chair after someone's gone. That's Rome. Centuries after its fall, the empire still haunted the world it had once ruled. Everywhere you looked, traces of it remained. Broken columns, Latin inscriptions, crumbling roads that still led somewhere. Farmers ploughed through ruins. Kings slept in palaces built for governors. Priests said prayers in churches built from marble once used for pagan temples. The empire was gone, but it was also everywhere. Let's start in Western Europe. By the time the year 1000 rolled around, the medieval world had grown from the soil of Rome's decay. Feudalism ruled the land, a patchwork of loyalties, oaths, and obligations. The idea of citizenship had faded, replaced by personal ties. Instead of serving an empire, people served a lord. Still, the old Roman instinct for order persisted in unexpected ways. Cathedrals rose on the foundations of Roman basilicas. The layout of cities like Paris, Cologne, and London still followed Roman grids. Even the word Senate survived, not with any real power, but as a memory of what governance once looked like. The Catholic Church carried Rome's DNA more faithfully than anyone else. Its hierarchy, its rituals, its language, all Roman. The Pope became the spiritual heir to the Caesars, ruling from the same city, under the same vaulted sky. If the emperors had ruled the body, the popes ruled the soul. And that balance, between the sacred and the secular, would define Europe for centuries. Kings ruled kingdoms, but popes crowned them. No one could claim full legitimacy without Rome's blessing, even long after the empire itself had turned to dust. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, a new power was rising, Islam. The early caliphate swept through old Roman lands with astonishing speed, taking Syria, Egypt, North Africa, and Spain. But even here, the shadow of Rome loomed. The caliphs inherited Roman roads, aqueducts, and cities. They studied Greek and Roman philosophy, preserving and expanding on knowledge that might have otherwise vanished. In Baghdad, scholars translated Aristotle and Galen into Arabic. In Cordoba, Spain, they built libraries larger than anything Europe had seen since the days of the Caesars. The Islamic world became the new custodian of the ancient legacy, while Europe stumbled through its dark centuries. Back in the East, the Byzantine Empire carried on, polished, complex, and slightly paranoid. It had outlived its Western twin by 1,000 years. Constantinople was the closest thing the world still had to ancient Rome, a city of golden domes, marble halls, and political intrigue so dense it could make Machiavelli blush. The Byzantines saw themselves as the true Romans, not imitators, but the real continuation. They called Westerners Latins, often with a hint of disdain, and considered themselves more civilized, and in many ways they were. Their bureaucracy was efficient, their diplomacy subtle, their art and architecture breathtaking, but time erodes even marble. By the 11th and 12th centuries, Byzantium faced new pressures: Crusaders from the west, Turks from the east, and the slow exhaustion of an empire that had simply lasted too long. In 1204, Western Crusaders, supposedly on their way to fight Muslims, instead sacked Constantinople, looting it beyond repair. For the first time, Christian fought Christian in the name of greed. It was the end of something profound, the unity, even illusionary, of Rome's spiritual legacy. 2.5 centuries later, in 1453, the walls of Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks. The last emperor, Constantine V, died fighting on the city walls. The final Roman, dying at his post. With him, the last breath of the Roman Empire faded into history. But that's not where Rome's story truly ends. Because even as the empire vanished from the map, its ghost rose again in the minds of those who came after. In the West, the Renaissance was about to begin. A rebirth of ancient thought, art, and ambition. Scholars in Florence and Venice rediscovered Roman manuscripts. Artists studied marble statues as if they were sacred relics. Architects looked to the ruins for inspiration, sketching arches, domes, and columns that would soon reappear across Europe. Rome became more than a place. It became an idea, a symbol of balance, reason, and grandeur, something to aspire to. When the humanists of the Renaissance said, "We are reviving Rome," they didn't mean building another empire. They meant resurrecting its soul, its curiosity, its love of knowledge, its pursuit of beauty. Still, others couldn't resist the imperial dream. Charlemagne had already tried centuries earlier. Later, the Holy Roman Emperors in Germany claimed to carry the torch. Even the Tsars of Russia called themselves Caesars, seeing Moscow as the Third Rome. Napoleon crowned himself emperor in a Roman-style ceremony. Mussolini literally rebuilt parts of Rome to look imperial again. Everyone wanted a piece of its legacy, even in failure, because Rome wasn't just history, it was a mirror, a reminder of what power can achieve and what pride can destroy. Now imagine standing in the Roman Forum today. The air is still. The sun spills over broken columns and half-buried temples. You can almost hear the echo of footsteps. Senators, soldiers, slaves, all long gone. The marble is cracked, the paint faded. But if you listen closely, the stones still whisper. They tell stories of ambition and arrogance, of genius and cruelty, of a people who believed they were eternal, and were in a way right. Rome didn't die, it transformed. Its spirit bled into languages, governments, religions, and ideas. It shaped continents. It defined what civilization means and what it costs. Empires rise and fall. Cities burn. Names fade. But Rome remains. Not in power, but in memory. And maybe that's the truest kind of immortality. Part 8. The Afterlife of an Empire. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still here, congratulations. You've officially outlasted several Roman emperors. Tonight, we're gliding through the long afterlife of the Roman Empire. The marbles crumbled, the legions are gone, but the idea of Rome still quietly haunting every corner of the modern world. Let's start with something simple. Words. If you speak English, Spanish, French, Italian, or Portuguese, congratulations again. You're basically speaking evolved Latin. Sure, it's the lazy, late-night version of Latin, full of slang and shortcuts, but it's Latin all the same. Imperium became empire. Rex became arroi or re. Even window in Italian, or finestra, comes from fenestra. The empire might have vanished, but the language it spoke found new homes in the mouths of millions. And language carries more than words. It carries memory. Every time someone says Senate, Forum, or Justice, they're unknowingly speaking little ghosts of Roman thought. The entire idea of law, written, organized, argued over, comes straight from them. Roman law was the empire's greatest export, far more enduring than any aqueduct or amphitheatre. It shaped how we think about rights, contracts, and property. The notion that law stands above any one ruler, that no one is literally above it, was born in the marble halls of Rome. Of course, that didn't stop emperors from ignoring it whenever it suited them, but the idea remained. Let's float for a bit into the Renaissance, where humanists treated Roman ruins like sacred text. They collected old manuscripts, translated Cicero, and debated Virgil as if the empire had just gone on lunch break. Painters like Raphael and sculptors like Michelangelo studied Roman anatomy, proportion, and symmetry. Even politics got the Roman treatment. Florence, Venice, and later France, England, and Spain all borrowed their civic ideals from the ancients. The dome of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, direct descendant of the Pantheon. The columns in Washington, D.C., straight out of a Roman architecture textbook, because nothing says modern democracy like copying the decor of an empire that famously wasn't one. The Romans also gave us the dream of infrastructure, roads that actually went somewhere. Their highways, over 250,000 miles of them, were the veins of the empire. And incredibly, some still exist today. A few Roman bridges still carry cars. Imagine that. Your morning commute powered by 2,000-year-old engineering. The same goes for plumbing, public baths, aqueducts, sewers, all part of their obsession with order and hygiene. Though to be fair, they also had lead pipes, which might explain some of the emperor's less rational decisions. But beyond the bricks and mortar, Rome gave the world a psychological blueprint for power. Every empire since has borrowed its playbook. The British Empire styled itself as the new Rome, disciplined, civilizing, convinced it was destined to rule. The American founding fathers filled their cities with neoclassical buildings, quoting Cicero and Livy like pop culture references. The Soviets called Moscow the Third Rome, and the European Union, that's basically the Roman Empire with paperwork and fewer helmets. Everyone wants to be Rome, but no one wants to admit it. Let's move to religion, because here's where the empire pulled off its greatest trick, transforming from persecutor to patron of Christianity. Early Christians hid in catacombs while emperors like Nero lit them on fire for sport. Fast forward a few centuries, and suddenly the cross was on imperial banners, carried by legions under Constantine's rule. Rome didn't just adopt Christianity, it repackaged it. It merged pagan rituals with Christian holidays, built churches on top of temples, and turned saints into something suspiciously like household gods. The church that emerged was both holy and bureaucratic, as Roman in its organization as it was Christian in spirit. The Pope became the new Caesar, still ruling from the same city under a different symbol. It's strange to think about. The empire that fell in 476 AD never truly stopped ruling. It just changed uniforms. Even time itself became Roman property. The calendar we use today, months named after emperors, leap years and all, came from Julius Caesar's reforms. The names we say without thinking, like July and August, literally honor men who died over 2,000 years ago. Time passes, but their names don't. That's legacy on a whole other level. Now, of course, not everything about Rome's survival was noble. The same structure that built aqueducts also built slavery into its foundation. Millions lived and died to keep the empire running. Men chained to quarries, women sold as concubines, children treated as property. Even their idea of entertainment, gladiators, executions, mock naval battles, was soaked in cruelty. It's easy to romanticize Rome, the togas, the statues, the wine, but the truth is, it was a brutal machine of control, held together by violence and spectacle. And maybe that's why it fascinates us. It's a mirror, one that shows both the brilliance and the ugliness of what humans can build. Let's drift to art for a moment. Roman art wasn't always original. They stole most of it from the Greeks, but they made it practical. Portraits that showed wrinkles, scars, and imperfections. Real faces, not idealized gods. They believed that showing truth was more powerful than showing beauty. Ironically, that honesty made their work timeless, and their stories, their myths, live on too. The gods of Olympus became the planets we still chart today. Jupiter, Venus, Mars. When we look at the night sky, we're still speaking the Roman language of awe. Even the way we organize our world, roads, governments, military ranks, taxes, echoes theirs. Modern cities still follow the Roman obsession with grids and symmetry. And bureaucracy, let's just say the Romans would have adored Excel sheets. But maybe the most fascinating thing about Rome's legacy is how it refuses to die quietly. Every generation rediscovers it and reshapes it to fit their own dreams. To the medieval monks, Rome was a lost paradise. To Renaissance artists, it was divine inspiration. To modern nations, it's a symbol of power and order. And to us, sitting here, scrolling through history videos at 2 a.m., it's something else entirely. It's a distant hum in the background of everything we know, because Rome isn't gone. It's in our architecture, our language, our politics, even our sleep. The empire that fell 1,500 years ago still whispers in our ears when we talk about civilization, law, and glory. Let's float to one last thought before we drift off. Maybe the reason Rome captivates us is that it feels familiar. Not because we live like Romans, but because we think like them. We build systems, we chase progress, we believe in the permanence of what we make, just like they did. And one day, centuries from now, someone might stand in the ruins of our cities, tracing their fingers over the faded words of our signs, wondering how we lived, how we dreamed, how we fell, and maybe, just maybe, they'll say, this was their Rome. Part 9, Everyday Echoes of Empire. All right, we're still here, quietly floating through history. By now, you might be feeling a little drowsy, perfectly normal. So let's take a gentle stroll through how Rome's collapse and afterlife affected the everyday lives of people who weren't emperors, senators, or generals, because honestly, most people in the Roman Empire weren't sipping wine in villas or giving speeches in the forum. They were farmers, bakers, shoemakers, and laborers. And when the empire started to crumble in the West, their lives changed, subtly, sometimes dramatically, always persistently. Imagine a farmer in Gaul around the 5th century. He wakes up at dawn, feeds the animals, checks the fields. The roads that once carried merchants and soldiers are partially broken, and the nearest market is farther away. Trade goods arrive slowly, and coins are scarcer than they used to be. Taxes are confusing, sometimes in coins, sometimes in kind, sometimes simply demanded by whoever has the bigger sword that day. Villages shrink because people move toward fortified centers for protection. That's the birth of medieval towns, clustered around castles and churches. Safety is scarce. Walls are everything. The old Roman roads still guide travelers, but their upkeep is spotty. Bridges are washed out. Aqueducts leak. Life is quieter but harsher. Meanwhile, artisans, blacksmiths, potters, carpenters adapt to these changes. Demand shifts from luxury goods to survival tools. Wealthy Roman patrons are gone, replaced by local lords who care more about armor than art. The smith who once forged decorative gates now makes weapons, horseshoes and nails. The carpenter who built villas now builds barns and keeps the village dry during winter storms. Religion becomes more central to daily life. Pagan temples are replaced by churches. Priests and monks offer guidance, education and charity. They're the anchors in a world of uncertainty. For ordinary people, the church is the closest thing to stable government. It mediates disputes, maintains records, and even organizes festivals. Festivals that now mix old Roman traditions with Christian stories. Travel is dangerous. Bandits roam the countryside. Wolves sometimes prowl near villages. Farmers rely on their neighbors more than distant rulers. Community becomes survival. And oddly enough, this creates a culture that is resilient, resourceful, and stubbornly alive. Even food habits reflect change. Rome's imported luxuries, olive oil, wine, exotic spices, become rare. People eat locally, bread, vegetables, whatever meat they can raise or hunt. Salt is treasured. Storage methods become more practical. Cuisine becomes simpler, but still satisfying. Every meal carries a hint of adaptation, a whisper of resilience. Education shifts as well. In the West, literacy declines. Where once citizens read public decrees and literature, now only clergy and some nobles maintain reading skills. Monasteries preserve knowledge, copying texts laboriously by hand. They are the quiet custodians of memory. The loss of public education means wisdom is concentrated in small pockets, but those pockets are surprisingly influential. Trade continues, but on smaller scales. Markets connect nearby towns rather than the whole empire. Craftsmen barter goods. Coins are reused. The rhythm of commerce slows. Life becomes less flashy, more grounded. Yet some Roman habits persist. Festivals, local governance structures, and even certain legal principles survive. People may not know why, but they honor old customs. Taxes, court procedures, marriage contracts. Rome's shadow lingers in habits and rules that outlive emperors. Let's glance east for a moment. In Constantinople, life is busier, louder, more urban. Markets are vibrant. Ships unload cargo. The bureaucracy hums. Scholars study classical texts. Citizens walk beneath mosaics and golden domes. They live in a city that still feels very Roman, even as the centuries pass. And for a few centuries, that city represents a kind of cultural lighthouse. Scholars and travelers pass through, bringing ideas west. Byzantine knowledge seeps slowly into Western Europe. Mathematics, medicine, philosophy, military strategy. The West, slower to recover, absorbs these ideas gradually, patch by patch. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, life is quieter. Forests dominate, small villages cluster near rivers. Kings rule smaller territories. Feudal obligations dominate daily life. Knights patrol, lords collect, peasants toil. The Roman ideal of empire seems almost mythical. Distant stories of grandeur, but irrelevant to chopping wood or tending sheep. Still, the memory of Rome shapes aspirations. Kings build fortresses to mimic Roman engineering. Churches are designed to reflect Roman basilicas. Chronicles recount Roman legends. People imitate grandeur in ways that are manageable within their limited resources. Even clothing carries echoes of Rome. Tunics, cloaks, and belts evolve from Roman models. Nobility flaunts wealth in ways that are conspicuously Roman. Embroidery, jewelry, and patterned fabrics. Peasants adapt practical elements. Fashion becomes a subtle continuation of the past. Medicine and science survive through careful monks and scholars. Galen's texts circulate in monasteries. Remedies, surgical techniques, and anatomical knowledge are preserved. The basic understanding of health passes from Roman doctors to medieval healers, often filtered through translation errors and local practices. But it survives nonetheless. Rome's influence permeates even entertainment. Gladiatorial games fade, but festivals, theatre, music and storytelling continue. Public spaces once used for civic life are adapted for fairs, jousts and performances. Community events maintain social cohesion. Finally, the concept of citizenship doesn't vanish completely. Towns and villages retain some autonomy, governed by local councils. Laws, contracts and customs remain enforceable. People exercise small measures of self-governance. A faint echo of Roman civics that will later inspire Renaissance and Enlightenment thinkers. So, everyday life after Rome is a mosaic of adaptation. People survive by mixing old knowledge with new realities. Communities persist by adjusting expectations. Cultures evolve by blending Roman memory with local innovation. And in that quiet persistence lies the brilliance of history. Rome falls, yet the lessons, the systems, the habits, the dreams, the echoes, they endure. You, sitting in your chair, are witnessing the afterglow of an empire that still shapes how we live, think, and dream. Part 10. Reflections on an enduring legacy or rite. We've wandered through centuries now, quietly tracing the threads of Rome from its peak, through collapse, and into its afterlife. Let's take a moment to reflect on what it all means. For the world, for ordinary people, and maybe even for us, sitting here in the dark, letting history lull us towards sleep. By the time the Middle Ages fully settle in, Rome is gone as a political entity. The legions no longer march, the emperors no longer sign decrees, the Senate no longer debates in marble chambers. Yet, in every corner of Europe, the empire's influence remains. Roads, bridges, cities, law, religion, language, and culture all bear its fingerprints. Even in the absence of central authority, life gradually organizes itself. Feudal systems, local lords, guilds, monasteries, and churches provide structure where Rome once did. The empire's collapse doesn't mean chaos everywhere. It just means that power becomes smaller, more fragmented, and often more personal. Still, every ruler, every thinker, every architect draws inspiration from Rome. Charlemagne calls himself Emperor of the Romans. Renaissance artists sketch ruins and study statues. European courts imitate Roman ceremony, fashion, and rhetoric. Even centuries later, political leaders like Napoleon and Mussolini evoke Rome's imagery to legitimize their power. Rome's ghosts linger long after the body is gone. Consider law and governance. Roman legal principles underpin medieval codes, canon law, and eventually modern civil law systems. The concept of citizens and legal rights may be diluted during the Dark Ages, but the framework survives. Courts, contracts, inheritance, all carry Roman DNA. Even the Holy Roman Empire, with all its flaws and contradictions, is a testament to Rome's enduring influence. Culturally, the empire's legacy is just as striking. Latin evolves into modern Romance languages, keeping the memory alive in everyday speech. Literature, philosophy, and science preserved in monastic scriptoria survive to inspire the Renaissance and beyond. Architecture, from arches to domes to basilicas, continues to shape skylines worldwide. In daily life, the echoes are quieter but still present. Villages retain Roman grid layouts. Roads and aqueducts remain in use. Festivals and religious rituals merge Roman and Christian traditions. Even mundane things, calendars, measurements, engineering techniques, all trace back to Roman ingenuity. But perhaps the most important legacy is psychological. Rome provides a model, a mirror, and a warning. It represents both human ambition and human frailty. Empires rise and fall, but ideas endure. Civilization is fragile yet persistent. Power is temporary, yet influence can be eternal. As we drift through this long story, it's clear that history is less about dramatic battles or shocking events, and more about quiet continuity. Rome may have fallen politically, but it never truly vanished. Its essence survives in language, law, infrastructure, religion, culture, and imagination. So as you settle in tonight, perhaps dim the lights a little more, breathe slowly, and let the weight of centuries gently press against your consciousness. Imagine walking through ancient ruins, tracing cracks in marble, reading inscriptions, and feeling the soft echo of lives long gone. The Roman Empire, in all its glory and all its flaws, lives on, not in power, not in armies, not in walls of stone alone, but in the ideas, systems, and culture that shape the world to this day. And maybe, just maybe, in the quiet rhythm of your own thoughts as you fall asleep, You are carrying a tiny fragment of Rome forward. Rest easy. Rome has been whispering for over 2 millennia, and tonight it whispers to you.